Welcome. I'm Barry Friedman. I'm a psychotherapist in private practice in Oakland, California, and I'm an instructor in the history of religions at Holy Names College in Oakland, California. I'm speaking today with Reverend Jim Conlon, the director of Sophia Center at Holy Names College. Welcome, Jim.
Hi, Barry. Good to be with you.
Good to see you. We're going to be talking today about a number of things. We'll be discussing the Sophia Center, Jim's new book, The Sacred Impulse, and about a new vision of life, culture, and spirituality, which is emerging in places like Sophia Center. So first, Jim, I'd like to ask you to share a bit about Sophia Center, its purpose and its mission.
Thank you, Barry. I thought one of the ways I could respond to that question is to tell a story that happened to me yesterday. I was sitting in my office. It was about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And suddenly there was a person at the door. And I had never met her. I didn't know who she was. She said, "Is this Sophia Center?" And I said it was and welcomed her. I discovered that she was a young woman from Brooklyn, New York, who on one occasion had been talking to Rosemary Radford Ruther, who is an outstanding theologian on our faculty. And she was looking for a place. This woman is in her middle age, midlife. She's working in the Catholic Worker Program in Brooklyn. And as we talked, it was clear to me that she was looking for something that would give meaning and purpose to her life. She was looking to sort of understand herself, her story, and maybe a context where she could feel that she really had a vocation, a calling, a purpose that would give her whole life meaning. And so as we talked, it became clear that the Sophia Center could be one option for that kind of question. Because at our program, we held people respond to the question, what's next in your life? That's what we use on our brochure as a kind of opening. Because people are looking for something, especially since 9/11 in New York. And then, of course, the whole series of events that have happened around the world, from Oklahoma City to Afghanistan, to the Middle East, to the high schools in Germany, to Columbine in Colorado. There's an increased intensity that I find in people searching for some purpose and understanding in their lives, to understand their story. Sometimes we say spirituality is awakening to your story with the earth in mind. And so Sophia is about that. It's a wisdom school. When we talk about wisdom at our program, we're talking about the capacity for a listening heart, to be receptive, not just for an interaction with another person or for the inner promptings, which I call the sacred impulse, that voice within that we listen to and act upon, but also our connection to the planet, our connection to the divine that we search for and long to have a connection with. So I love your question because it's a question that many of us have today.
Jim, I'd like to return to a number of the things that you've mentioned as we proceed, but before we do that, I'd like you to share with us, if you would, some of the intellectual antecedents and underpinnings that support Sophia Center.
Right. Well, the Sophia program is really developed around what we would call the fourfold wisdom. The wisdom of science. So here we look to the work of Einstein, Hubble, and those who have developed and helped us understand, David Bohm would be another one, to understand that the universe began some 13 or 14 billion years ago, that it's unfolding in time, and that humanity is searching for a place in that unfolding story of the universe. So we look to the antecedents of the scientists, those who understand evolution, quantum mechanics, the whole mystery, the empirical understanding of the universe, which is different than simply seeing everything as material. We understand this as kind of a sacramental consciousness that science reveals to us. Mm-hmm. We also stand and look towards our indigenous elders and ancestors. People like those who grew up and had a connection to the universe. Mm-hmm. They sort of knew where they were when they were children. They had a purpose. Their lives were connected. Mother Earth, Father Sky, that kind of understanding. That's what we search for in our program. Because in a sense, the indigenous peoples, Black Elk Speaks, is a great kind of text that reveals to us. As a child, I grew up on a reservation, near a reservation of the Chippewa and Potawatomis in Canada. And I've learned to understand that the indigenous people have much to teach us.
Indeed.
You know, Thomas Barry, who is one of the antecedents, if you will, intellectual guide for our work, who's a Passionist priest, 87 years old at this time, living in North Carolina. He was up at a reservation in Ontario, Canada, a few years ago, and he was going there to give a talk. And they said to him, "Thomas, we'd like you to give us a presentation." So he had a few minutes before his talk, and he went outside of this building where the presentation was to take place. And he looked at the tree and he said, "Tree, what should I say?" And the tree said, "Tell him the story." And then he looked at the sky and he said, "Sun, what should I say?" The sun said, "Tell him the story." Same answer came from the river and from the beaver and from the deer that lives up there. So Thomas is one of those who have taken the work of Teilhard de Chardin, who was a Jesuit priest, paleontologist, scientist, and someone deeply connected to understanding how the universe, how science and spirituality are companions rather than adversaries. Teilhard is one of the great teachers of our time. He taught us that we should spend more time with creation and less worrying about redemption. We should spend more time exploring how each aspect of our universe has a psycho-spiritual dimension, an interior life, and how everything is unique and connected. Teilhard was one of our great teachers. He died in 1955. Thomas Barry, in a sense, took his work into the ecological age, into the time that we're now living, where the planetary chaos and devastation is so acute. And now it's our turn. And that's what Sophia is about, to stand on the shoulders of these great prophets and move forward to what we would call a more mutual enhancing life, where every relationship grows the soul of all of us, and that we have a healthier planet for our children. Pure water, clean air, joy, playfulness, and much beauty. That's our hope.
Thank you, Jim. I hear in the vision that you're sharing a paradigm which goes beyond duality,
Yes.
into a paradigm of interconnectedness and inclusivity.
That's right.
You made mention before of some of the current events that are occurring in the world right now. Mm-hmm. There's a great deal of turbulence and even chaos in the world.
That's right.
We have Columbine, 9/11, the Middle East, environmental problems. how do you see Sophia Center as addressing, and places like it, as addressing those issues? How is it relevant to the contemporary world?
Great question, a wonderful question. You know, a few weeks ago, I was at a gathering where Helen Kellicott, who's a medical doctor, the foundress of the Physicians for Social Responsibility. She described our particular moment, I think, incredibly incisively. What she said was, our culture has metastasized. That there's this kind of, overgrowth. We see it in high-rise buildings. We see it in cities that have gone out of control. We see it in classrooms where there are too many students for the teachers and for each other to learn. In a sense, the culture has cancer. That's what I think she's telling us. Why is that? One reason, I believe, is that we've forgotten that we're intimately related to each other. If we look at this new cosmology, we call it a new cosmology, a story, an origin story, our place in the universe and how it unfolds, we begin to realize that at the beginning, it all came from one point, one little spark of energy that erupted and unfurled and continues to unfold. If we understand that, as one of your students and one of mine was saying recently, Patty was saying, if we could just understand that one point, it would change everything. And I think that's what we're coming to. Years ago, not that many years ago, there was an outgrowth of writings on so-called dysfunction, the dysfunctional family. There was the dysfunctional organization, there was the dysfunctional, when society became an addict, addiction and dysfunctionality were high on the radar screen of how we were naming our cultural problems. Our society is living out a story that fosters separation, mechanism, and in some way, some would even call our society today a culture of death. I believe what Sophia and others around our planet are fostering is the capacity to live in a mutual enhancing way with a functional cosmology where we understand that how the universe is unfolding in time is, in a way, a template, a possibility of how we can learn and create a culture that is functional. There's more to say about that. One of the ways I talk about that, and we teach at Sophia, is what we call geo-justice. Now, what is geo-justice? Geo-justice is basically a dynamic integration of what we learn from the universe and how we can structure a society that is filled with balance, with peace, with harmony. If we look at how the world is organized, there are basically three principles that are operative everywhere in life. One is everything's related. We feel each other's presence. Sometimes a phone call comes just the moment before we're going to pick up the phone. Sometimes an event in New Zealand can disturb a weather pattern in New Jersey. There's something that we're all related. David Bohm, the scientist, taught us that there's no evidence or scientific empirical evidence of separation. And yet we live in a culture of exile and alienation. So we can learn from the universe. We can learn to develop relationships, communal relationships. We can learn from women to have an archetype of inclusion where we're not living in patriarchal dominating structures, but rather inclusive webs of life. And also everything's different in the universe. But as humans, we have a great problem with difference. That's where racism comes from, sexism, classism. These problems that we are relating to are somewhat in opposition to the very fabric of how how the divine has created us, unique and different. And also, there's a deep sense of soul in all of us, a kind of interior life, a personality that every tree has, that every person has, that every child has. And so my vision is to take these principles, respect difference, celebrate it as some kind of manifestation of great beauty, celebrate our relationships, and honor that interior dimension that exists not just in the child or the adult, but in the tree. The native people say if you cut down the tree will scream. There's life there. We need to honor.
Thank you, Jim. You speak of the idea of exile, that we're in a condition of exile, and I'm reminded of how that idea is a part of so many of the major spiritual traditions in the world now. And so what I'm hearing is that your vision and the vision of Sophia Center and places like Sophia Center is to find the way toward redemption, but in a very appropriate and contemporary sense.
One of the great biblical archetypal images that runs through a lot of spiritual paths today is the Exodus. Because the Exodus is that liberation moment from, in a sense, from slavery to freedom. I believe that we are living in an Exodus moment, a possibility, which some would call a moment of grace, a moment where enormous and transformative energy is possible, perhaps unprecedented in human history. And yet at the same time, we need to make that transition. We need to let go of the things that hold us back and move forward. So we're at that wonderful sort of watershed. Sam Keene has this work up in Sonoma County, which is not far here from the Bay Area. He takes people who are addicted onto a trapeze and teaches them how to free themselves of their chemical addictions. I think that we need a cosmological trapeze to free us from a culture of addictions. And that's what Sophia, in one way, is about.
Implicit in a lot of what you're saying, Jim, is the idea of narrative and story.
Exactly.
And you make mention in your book, The Sacred Impulse, about the new story.
Right.
And as I recall, you also enumerate several principles, 3 principles of interiority, community, and what's the last?
Differentiation.
Differentiation, yes. Would you speak to that?
Yeah. Well, when I was talking about geo-justice, I was kind of referring to those principles. The whole notion of our society being with the new story, I have 2 images for that. One of the great teachers of my own personal life, and for many people, especially in Latin America, was Paulo Freire. Paulo was a lawyer from Brazil who went to court for the first time in his profession, decided that he was being asked to defend the guilty person, and no longer practiced his profession. He became an educator. He was saying just a few years ago that what we are living in is a huge computer. That in a sense, our lives are programmed. Some would say they're programmed by the 4 great patriarchies, by religion, by politics, by economics, and by the whole social educational movement. It's really tragic that classrooms are now war zones rather than liberation movements.
Yes, indeed.
So I heard this other story. So here we are in this great computer. How do we get out of it? How do we move through this exodus moment? Think of the story of a little chick in an eggshell. The little chick, as it starts to grow, it begins to consume everything that's in the egg to feed itself, to in some way get the nourishment to become mature. And in a sense, we are humans. In the eggshell, if you will, is the culture and society in which we're born. And in a sense, we've consumed the nourishment that our religious traditions have given us, that our cultures and our ancestors have given us, that the political system and the economic system offers us. And you know what happens to the chick? The chick has to break out of the shell and into a whole new world. In a sense, that's what we're about here. We're about breaking the shell of the old cosmology and breaking it into the new story. That's what the new story is about. We're these new principles. A friend of mine once said, you know, if we really practice these principles, honor difference, celebrate relationship, and foster the unique personality of each dimension of creation, we would have a better world for our children. We would have a world of justice. And you know what? We would be telling the new story in our time. And the moral guidelines of the Ten Commandments, in a sense, would be, in a sense, supplanted by these three principles, which are inclusive of all these directives, if you will.
I see, Jim. Thank you. We have just a few minutes left. I wanted to ask you about something that you make reference to in your book. You mentioned Joanna Macy and her commentary on our society as a vocationless culture. And I was wondering both what you think she means by that, and also what you mean in response by vocational destiny.
Thank you for that question. You know, I refer back to the woman who came to visit yesterday. She's 45. She's living a very meaningful life, working with housing and the Catholic worker movement in Brooklyn. But on some level, she feels disconnected. She doesn't feel like she has a real life direction. And she was kind of mourning that as we talked. My understanding is what Joanna Macy's talking about, a great deep ecologist and Buddhist scholar here in the Bay Area. What I think Joanna's saying is that people have generosity, but they don't have a place in which to express that generosity. Years ago, I went to a seminary because I felt I wanted to do something with my life, and it felt at that time that the seminary was the appropriate context in which to be, make a contribution. And I think today, young people are searching for the context. They have some purpose. They have some sense of generosity, but they're not quite sure where to do it, where to live that, because the structures like politics, economics, religion, and education don't seem to be the receptacles of that kind of generosity. They're looking for some place to live it out. And that's what I mean by destiny, that all of us have a life purpose. We're being called to something. I'm not talking about a narrow religious perspective. I'm talking about what I call the sacred impulse, to live fully, to respond to the generosity that's in us, and to live in a meaningful and fruitful way. Not necessarily with notoriety by any means, but with wholesome contribution and a sense of satisfaction and accomplishment.
So I hear that context is essentially important.
I think so.
For people to really discover both the truth of their own calling and also its relevance to the world at large.
That's right. I think we can never do alone what we can do together. And that is more and more, I believe, evident today, because there's such a growing mistrust of what some would call the patriarchal structures of society. We need to find support systems, alternative movements, and where people can feel like they're connected and yet supported in their own particular gift. We call that the great work. Thomas Barry, Rilke, others call this the great work, that every society has a task to do in a response to a particular crisis. We have an ecological crisis. We're hovering around a nuclear crisis. And also violence and war, peace nowhere. That's our calling, I believe, to be in the great work, to find humanity's mission today.
Thank you, Jim. I look forward to talking with you more about the great work and about the new story. And I thank you for sharing so much of this wonderful vision of wholeness and healing that you and Sophia Center are offering to...
And you as well, as a faculty member.
Thank
Absolutely.
to the world. I think it's very needed. So I look forward to having a further conversation with you.
I do too, Barry. Thank you very much. I enjoyed this.
Okay. Thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you again soon. Take care.